Corto is a board game inspired by the Italian comic book Corto Maltese, created by Hugo Pratt in the 60s. This is a comic book that is very popular in Italy still to this day, also is very popular in France, and it has been published internationally in other countries too. Corto Maltese is a comic book about an adventurer. Corto Maltese is the name of the protagonist. The stories are set early in the 20th century, in the 10s and the 20s mainly. And these stories deal with adventures of Corto Maltese, who is a little bit of a pirate in a sense. Sometimes they do call him like that. I would say he's more of an adventurer, a dreamer, a romantic. He travels around the world, getting himself carried by the flow of the events. He's not an adventurer in the sense of a superhero, like somebody who wants to get there and get the job done. He has more of a fatalistic approach, and his stories have indeed a dreamy, fatalistic quality. They're very, very unique in atmosphere. But this is not a review of the comic book, come to think of it. This is a review of the board game, which came out recently. And I got interested because this semester I'm teaching a graduate seminar at Indiana University about Italian comic books and graphic novels. It's a history of 20th century Italian comics. And we have a section of on Corto Maltese, so I thought that maybe my students would be interested in trying it out. If nothing else, I can show to the class that the comic book is still relevant. The comic book has influenced many media, and even has an incarnation in board gaming. Corto Maltese is a game for 2 to 4 players, where the players play the role of adventurers that try to interact with him. You do not play the role of Corto Maltese, and also you do not play the role of Rasputin, who is another character in the comic books and in the game, who is someone in between of a nemesis and a best friend for Corto. The relationship between the two is pretty complex and changes throughout the stories. It's a game that tries hard to capture the feeling of the game, the feeling of the comic book, the atmosphere of the comic book, the theme of the comic book. It is not just a general game with that theme. There is a comic book quality that the designers of the game tried real hard to capture. And I can already anticipate this from my conclusions. I think that they did that well. I think they succeeded in that. Let me show how the game works. The game comes with 6 strips, such as this one, which you use to construct the board. Each strip is inspired by a story about Corto Maltese. This, for example, this one is about Corto in Africa, Corto in Ireland. There we have the Ballad of the Salted Sea, one of the most famous stories, Samarkand, and one of my personal favorite ones, Corto in Siberia. In each game, you will select 4 of these to form a board. Unless you are playing with 2 players, then you only use 3. And here I've set up a 2-player game just to show how the game looks at the beginning of the game. So as you can see, by combining different strips and different boards each time, you will have a lot of variety. Each player has a pool of counters of a specific color. At the beginning of the game, you place the strips there, and they form the board. Each strip also comes with an associated deck of cards. You shuffle the cards together. You turn cards until the card of a character, a card representing a character, is found, and you place that in the first space. You repeat that for all 3 or 4 strips. Then each player places a token on one of the initial cards, and the game is pretty much ready to start. First thing that the players do is to select a hand of cards. They can draw 4 cards from any of those decks. That forms their initial hand. Then, in each turn, you can do one of several things. You can play cards from your hand up to a maximum of 4, but that means you can play your entire hand if you so wish. But at the end of your turn, then you will be able to only draw 2 cards back into your hand, or you can choose to discard cards without playing cards, and in that case, you can refill your hand up to your maximum of 4 cards. cards represent characters, such as these cards. There may be effects, and you simply, when you play the card, resolve the effect written there. There are cards representing Corto, and other cards representing Rasputin. Corto is the hero of the story. He's represented by this gorgeous figurine here. And Rasputin is sometimes an enemy, sometimes a friend, sort of like a nemesis, the evil, I should say, amoral twin of Corto. An adventurer like Corto, but without the morals, just more prone to commit crimes and to work for self-interest only. As I said, during your turn you can play cards. Okay, if you play a character, you have to play the character in the strip that belongs to that color, and you have to place that adjacent to a character that already is in play. Every time that you play a new character, that has to be adjacent to a character that is already in play, but you can also use adjacency from different strips. For example, if this is the case, I could place a character there because it is adjacent to one of the characters that are in play. When you place a character, you look at the board of the border of the character. First, you place a token on the character that you just placed, and then you may perform an action based on the border of the character. A white border allows you to place one of your tokens also on an adjacent character. So I could place a token there or a token there. If you put down a character with a black border, again you place a token there. As you put it down, then you can perform an action, which in this case is to remove a token from one of the adjacent characters. If this was the situation, I could use that action given to me by the black border to remove that token there. There are also items such as this one. White border items allow you to add the tokens, and black border items such as this one allow you to remove tokens. Usually you play an item on a character as you place the character on the board, and you perform the action of adding or removing tokens in the adjacent spaces. However, there are some items such as this one with this symbol here or this symbol here. They are long distance, and that means that they can perform the action anywhere in the strip in which they are placed and anywhere in the column in which they're placed. Just imagine that the range extends as much as possible in the orthogonal directions. Also, the number of onomatopoeias that are present on the item indicates the number of times that you can perform that action. For example, with this card, with this item, I would be able to remove a token. This one has 2 onomatopoeias. This card adds tokens, but I would be able to add 2 because the sound is present twice. Now, when you play a Corto card, which is not just indicated only by the picture of the guy, but also by that symbol, you bring Corto on the board. The first time that a Corto action is played, he appears on one of the decks, and then he can be moved 0 to 3 spaces, like in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, whatever. After he has moved, he has an area of influence that includes the place in which he is and the 8 spaces adjacent to it. After he has moved, you can perform an action with him. An action has to be performed or influences the area of influence. You can add 2 of your tokens to the board on a card in the area of influence of Corto, where Corto is at that point, or you can choose to cash in gold. Each character who is a friend of Corto's, and you can see that because they're thinking of him. Now, these are good friends, always thinking of him. If a character has the Corto icon in a thought balloon, and that card is in the influence area when you want to perform the gold action, then the player that has the majority on the character receives a gold. So in this case, I'm the green player, I'm activating Corto to give me money, then I get a gold for that card because that's a friend of Corto's, gold for this one and gold for this one. Here, my opponent also has a Corto Carter in the area of influence, and my opponent has majority there, has control of that Carter, then my opponent in that case gains a gold. To represent gold, you use cards from the discard pile and you slide them under your token, so each card is under there counts as 1 gold. When Rasputin is brought onto the board, he also moves up to 3 spaces, and then he can immediately eliminate a character card located in his area of influence. Also, when you're removing tokens, if you are removing a token from a card that has tokens there, then you remove the token. If you do the remove the token action, you perform that action against a card that has no tokens, then the card is eliminated. You simply remove it. So, simply you keep playing cards and resolving the effects, which may be to add new characters to the board, to move Corto or Rasputin to perform actions, to add objects that you play together with the characters, to perform special actions. You continue like this until 2 strips on the board are completely filled with characters. At that point, the game is over and players score points. You look when you're counting for your points. When you're counting your points, you look at the group of your tokens, which is the largest. So the group of connected tokens, in this case, my largest group, also my only group, would be of 4 tokens. Tokens in your largest group of tokens are worth 2 points. Tokens in a smaller group of tokens are worth 1. So in that case, I'll get 1 point for each of those guys. Tokens which are alone, not connected with other tokens, are worth 0. This is the basic idea of the game. What is very cool though is that the strips also have specific rules. Each strip represents a different adventure, but also has specific rules. For example, when you're playing this adventure here, there will be cards that will come out that have a symbol that will add a token of this type, a low part token, on the card, and who controls that card controls that token, and those tokens at the end can be used to create connections between your groups to make larger groups. This one, the strip allows you to gain gold. There are gold tokens that are placed here, and if you place certain characters in these areas, you get that amount of gold. Here you have a train. When you place a card on this board, the train moves by 1. So as the characters move in this direction or added in this direction, the train also moves, and you can attack the train from an adjacent space using attack actions, the black actions. And when you attack the train, then you gain a token from this pile here, and you may get gold, or you may get boom actions, which are attack actions. Lot of cool things. With this board here, when you play a character with that symbol there, here it is, the symbol, then you can move the ship by 3 spaces, and then you can place a token in an adjacent space, in an area that is adjacent to the ship after the ship moved. A lot of variety, a lot of different effects. It's not just a matter of different strips looking different and giving a different aesthetic experience, but also the strips come with different decks that have different characters, different abilities, different rules, and different things that you can try that you should try to achieve in order to gain points. A lot of variety there, and I like that a lot. Now, the game as a game to me is really difficult to detach from the comic book. A game inspired from a source should be a game that is playable and enjoyable also for players that do not know that source. For example, personally, I'm not a big fan of Battlestar Galactica, the TV show. Oh, heresy. But that is it. That's the truth of it. And I still enjoy the game very much. The game clearly has its own worth, merit, and personality. Is this what happens in Corto? It's different. I think that Corto depends much more the enjoyment that you may have with Corto depends much more on your knowledge and appreciation for the comic book. Let's start by talking about the game per se. The game over per se is, if you don't know, the original comic book is pretty simple. It's pretty light. It changes very much based on the number of players that you have. With 3 or 4 players, the game feels pretty chaotic. It does feel pretty much like it happens in the comic book, like you're just an agent in a world of changes that you really cannot control. With 4 players, when the game comes back to you, very often the board will look quite different from the way it was before, so it's more tactical. You have to react to the general chaos that's happening. You don't feel completely helpless. You feel like you're still creating connections and expanding your group of allies and influencing what others do, but to a lesser degree than you have in a 2-player game. The 2-player game feels still fairly tight. Still, you're able to plan ahead more and to chain actions more because you're able to influence the board more before the opponent messes everything up for you. So the feel of the game is pretty different. Also, the length of the game changes, but overall the game does not overstay its welcome. And if it does, then you just start playing cards on a single strip and you and you kill it. But I don't see that happening. This is not a game that is particularly epic in scale. It is not a game that even gives you too much analysis paralysis, even though I guess potentially could. But all the resources that you have come from the cards. You can still choose which decks you want to draw from, so there is that level of decision, but at the end it is in the hands of the gods to give you friends, allies, resources, objects. It is not completely up to you, so again there is that level that escapes your control. In this sense, this is why it is very hard for me to detach the game from the comic book, because this does capture the spirit of the comic book, which is not a traditional, optimistic, deterministic adventure story. The good guy fights evil and wins because he's the darn good guy and deserves to do that. In the stories, there's a lot of randomness, things that happen unexpectedly. It captures that uncontrollable quality of human life. I'm saying this because maybe you don't know the comic book and you're reading and you look at the game and like, oh, why did the designers put so much randomness? I think it is totally meant. So if you do not know the comic book, and you play the game, this will be a pretty light game that doesn't last long, that has beautiful components, that still has meaningful decisions, but a lot of randomness. Within that randomness, you have enough options that you do still feel that you have an active play, that the game is not playing you entirely, but you have to take that into account. There is that quality of randomness which not everybody likes. If you know the comic book, then you see that this game really is a labor of love. It is because in the creation of the strips, the designers really worked hard to capture not just the general spirit of the world of Corto, but also the spirit of each story, from when he's in Africa, from when Corto is in Siberia, and so on and so forth, by creating specific objectives. Now, paradoxically, if you love the comic book very much and you are a fundamentalist fan of Corto, you may be annoyed that actually you can do things that are not faithful to the stories. You can move characters where they shouldn't be from story to story. Then paradoxically there may be that minus, but I think if you enjoy Corto, then probably you are a person that has a certain level of irony, a certain appreciation for freedom of expression, for unconventional creations, and then probably you will be able to stand this. To say, if nothing else, to say the fact that you can mess up with the storylines to a degree as possibly an homage again to the original comic book, which was indeed anti-conventional and broke many rules of adventure comics of the time. So a game that you may enjoy as a non-reader of Corto, but you would enjoy much more if you do know and possibly love Corto Maltese. If you've never read the comic book, maybe it's time to do so, because by the way, it is a very good comic book and would recommend it in general, even if you're not interested in the board game at all.